one.
The Alone in the Dark reboot was released in 2008, published by Atari and developed by Eden Games. Eden Games on the outset would have been an odd choice to develop a survival horror game, considering the studio had primarily developed racing games beforehand. Turns out, it was actually Eden Games who went to Atari with an idea for an Alone in the Dark game. They proposed their idea with a custom-made tech demo and everything. The game was first shown at E3 2006, but beyond that there aren't many details on the game's development. So instead of going into the making of the game, let's address the real elephant in the room. Alone in the Dark 2008 is infamous for its low quality. I'm certain anyone who has heard about this game knows it only because of how bad it is, and upon release the game was near universally panned. The game was so poorly received that Atari actually threatened to sue European game critics over their reviews, claiming that the reviews had to have been written with illegal copies as they hadn't given out review copies to these publications. A site called GamerNI disagreed, claiming that they actually were given review copies, but Atari only did so under the condition that pre-embargo reviews were positive. For those not familiar with the term, a review embargo is a written agreement between the company distributing a piece of media and the critic stating that they can experience said media early to compose their thoughts on it, on agreement that they don't post their reviews until a set date. Considering no lawsuits against publications were filed by Atari, it's safe to say that GamerNI's spin on the story is a little closer to the truth. With all of this very public controversy, it was pretty much impossible to go into this game without a preconceived notion of what I'd be reviewing. Even if I could have though, the setup and issues of playing the PC version of the game would have put a bad taste in my mouth from the get-go. Alone in the Dark 2008 is a holdover from the recently bygone era of PC games that were just lazy ports of the console version. The game was initially released on the Xbox 360 and the PC, and the former is what the latter is very clearly based on. It even has the Xbox user interface at the A and B buttons, just with a checkmark and cross respectively. The odd key binding choices could also be indicative of this low effort porting, with print screen being used for jumping off of ropes and home and end being used to raise and lower a forklift at one point. Let's get into the setup of the game, because while it isn't as outright broken out of the box as the new nightmare on current systems could be, 2008 still is not ideal. I made sure to set compatibility to Windows Vista just to avoid the crashing issues that some have complained about. Even beyond that though, there are some bizarre faults here. For example, trying to access the display settings causes the game to hard crash even after changing the compatibility. And trying to exit the game through Task Manager is, to my knowledge, pretty much impossible. To record the footage, I had to record my entire monitor and hope that the game was picked up through it, so everything looked like this. The setup was a bad start, but it only went downhill from there. Alone in the Dark 2008 was a horror game released in a time when on-rails cinematics were king, and its opening reflects this. It's entirely in first person, and the only control you have for the longest time is walking in a line or blinking. The real kick in the teeth is that it can only be skipped if you skip the entire first chapter, which is something we'll explore later on in the review, but in the moment the game basically just has you sit through this interactive cutscene for what feels like a small eternity. I guess at the very least you actually can die here if you don't follow the orders of the guy who has a gun in your back, so the game isn't a complete insult on this front. The tutorial gets a bit less heavy-handed a little afterward, and on paper it's actually a pretty decent introduction for the game. The core mechanics are all introduced and done so in a way that isn't too obnoxious by the industry standards at that time. Still a little patronizing at times, but what can you do? However, the gameplay that this is a tutorial for isn't anything good. The single biggest misstep made by Eden had to be the sheer ambition they had while making the Alone in the Dark reboot. It tries to be an action adventure and survival horror game with open world elements, driving mechanics, and minor platforming segments thrown in. This is all while being able to switch between first and third person perspectives, with certain actions being limited to certain perspectives. We'll touch on each of these individually, but if I had to place a bet, I'd wager that the source of a lot of the game's issues was the overburdened vision. The perspective swapping was certainly an interesting choice, on paper giving the player the option to play whichever way they preferred, but sadly there are some issues with the implementation. You see, not every action can be performed from a single perspective. For a few examples, you can only shoot your gun or a fire extinguisher in first person, but can only use melee attacks and climb in third person. No matter what, you'll be constantly swapping perspectives, and this is a problem because first person is significantly better to navigate the game with than third person. The third-person controls are simply awful, with pseudo-tank controls being used in a game lacking the pre-rendered angles from the original Alone in the Dark and New Nightmare, and mixes that with platforming challenges. Needless to say, it's not the most accurate system. It's very easy to fall off of ledges when walking on narrow platforms. On top of that, the turn radius in this game is far too slow for quick and precise movement, which is something that first-person controls never have that much of an issue with. It controls like any other first-person game, mouse look and WASD, which makes walking along tight ledges or running around enemies manageable. It's ideal for most situations, but the actions that you'll have to perform will switch you to third-person by default. A part of me wonders why the entire game wasn't just made in first person, with the climbing sections being the only third-person segments or just being removed entirely. No matter which point of view you're playing from, Alone in the Dark 2008 has some input latency issues on the PC port, with actions taking a touch longer to respond to a key press than they should. It's not surprising based on the standard PC ports at the time, but it's still annoying nonetheless. The climbing and platforming here are in general unpleasant. It's less like the kind of stuff you'd see in Prince of Persia, and more like a slower version of Uncharted, if that makes any sense. The extent of your climbing abilities range from going up and down a rope, sliding along ledges, and moving objects out of your path. You do this by sliding from left to right beside it, and then jumping down when the coast is clear. Just a minor gripe, but puzzles like this are a chore considering the game's physics don't work consistently. Whether an object will get caught on something, not react to your own actions, or just flail wildly is up to chance, and one challenge in particular was bad for this. In the game's mandatory sewer section, you had to get an electric cable out of a pool of water by shooting it. The movement of this cable in response to the gunshot was incredibly erratic. I lucked out when it became stuck inside of a railing and permanently negated as a threat, but regardless, the in-game physics aren't good enough for this kind of challenge. Combat in Alone in the Dark 2008 is centered around a gimmick where enemies are for the most part invincible, only being temporarily incapacitated by traditional attacks if hit by the player enough. Invincible, unless of course you use fire against them in some way, because in that case they drop like flies at the touch of embers. It's an interesting concept, but very poorly executed as it stands. The sheer strength of fire against enemies means that encounters can range from entirely trivial to downright annoying based solely on the player's access to a fire source, though considering this is usually in steady supply, the former is most often the case. No matter what though, the fights are just boring because they boil down to a formula. For optimal play, use either a spray can and lighter to burn them, and failing that, just kite the enemies over to a fire source. Once there, either light a wooden melee weapon on fire and swing it at them, or just lie the enemy in front of the blaze and shoot them until the stun animation slides them into the fire. The only encounter that gave me any sort of trouble was this one inside of a small enclosed space, since the claustrophobic hallways led to it being hard to maneuver around these two. Beyond that though, fights are simple, dull affairs, not helped by the lack of variety in enemies and consistent weapons. Pretty much all melee weapons you pick up have the same function, and the only consistent weapon you carry is a pistol. This gun can kill small enemies in 1 or 2 shots, but can only stun the rank-and-file Deadite wannabes. That is, unless you combine the gun with alcohol to make fire bullets, and this is one aspect of Alone in the Dark 2008 that is at least kind of interesting. The game has some minor crafting elements thrown in, being able to mix and match different items. Mix alcohol and gas with the gun, make fire bullets. A glass bottle filled with liquor and some rags or bandages, Molotov. A plastic bottle filled with gas and cloth, bomb. And a sticky bomb as well if you mix some tape in there. There's also the prior mentioned lighter and spray can for a makeshift flamethrower, which includes the game's health spray taken straight from Resident Evil, and maybe even another offensive combination or two I simply didn't experiment with. It's by no means a deep system, but the inclusion is nice enough. Although your creative potential can be pretty limited thanks in no small part to the tiny inventory. You have an inventory of about 8 slots, with 2 dedicated slots for your flashlight and gun. The inventory is handled in a pretty neat way, with each slot being depicted as a spot in Carnby's jacket which you access in real time. On the other hand, the real-time inventory makes combining items on the fly unviable in the middle of a fight, which can lead to some annoying situations. There's also the omnipresent threat of running out of real resources that let you dish out some damage on enemies, and in that case you're forced to use melee combat. The melee combat in this game is outright awful, and should only be used as a last resort in an enemy encounter. Since you can't carry the larger melee weapons around with you, the game falls into this groove of running into combat arenas and using whatever you can pick up to kill guys. Chairs, lamps, fire extinguishers, it's all fair game. It's like the world's clunkiest version of Hotline Miami without any of the fun. How it's done is by rotating the mouse to fully extend the character's arms and then pressing the action button to swing. I imagine on console it was easier to pick this up as a stick would have been used, but with a mouse the game has a hard time registering if you fully extended to either the left or the right side, and if it doesn't register this, you cannot under any circumstance swing your weapon. At all. You'll just be ineffectively mashing the action button and trying to slide the mouse into place. And to top it off, a melee swipe from an enemy is usually enough to knock the weapon out of your hand. Needless to say, it's unreliable, and since melee weapons on their own still don't kill enemies, it's just not a really viable way to beat foes. That is, until you learn that wood objects can be lit on fire, which makes combat a cakewalk. Either swing burning objects at an enemy, or better yet, just hold it out in front of you on the enemy's model until they ignite. Overall though, since the game doesn't often force you into combat, you might be better off in the long run just ignoring fights entirely until the game locks you into a situation where you can't just up and leave. At that point, you should have saved a buttload of resources so that you can now trivialize the encounter. The only types of encounters that Alone in the Dark 2008 will always force you into are boss fights, which across the board are bad. With one exception, using firebombs on this hive thing, you're given no indication that your attacks are doing damage to a boss, so they usually just boil down to attacking it until it dies, and hoping that your preferred method is actually chipping away at their invisible health bar. There's also one enemy which I haven't touched on yet, called the Living Scar. It's a big red line in the ground that shows up, snakes along the floors, walls, and ceilings, and upon contact forces you into a QTE mash fight to pull yourself out. This could just be due to the fact that I'm an idiot, but the intended defense against this thing is incredibly unclear and never actually telegraphed to the player to my knowledge. It plays like a selective version of the floor is lava, and the only way around this thing without taking any damage from my experience is to hop around and try to move through an area it's attacking in as fast as you possibly can. An element tied to the combat which causes some problems is the game's health system, which is, in a word, unclear. I do know it's based on damage taken to individual body parts on Carnaby's model, which you heal piece by using the first aid spray. What isn't apparent is how much abuse you can actually take before dying, because Alone in the Dark 2008 has no proper health bar. I didn't actually heal at any point for the first 3 chapters of the game, outside of the mandatory section and the tutorial, so whatever the amount I had, I was clearly fine despite taking a fair bit of hits. The original Alone in the Dark had a number for your health, and New Nightmare had the status bar, so this having absolutely nothing like that is a massive step backward. And there's something of an environmental hazard which I'm almost confident caused 90% of my deaths in the game, being this black goo floor thing. It's a pulsing surface that kills you the second it makes contact, and the only way to ward it off is with light. Fire, your flashlight, any light at all. Here's the issue with it. Occasionally, the goo will just ignore your lights and kill you anyway, since the pulse will clip into you despite there being a light source. It's annoying, and these sections simply just are not enjoyable in any way. I have no idea who thought this was a good idea. To sum up my general feelings on the combat, it has many interesting ideas, but the execution paired with the numerous technical issues bring down the whole thing. Eden Games just tried to do too much, and as a result didn't really explore any individual aspect of their concepts. Tight controls, more reliable melee combat, and a greater variety of enemies would also have helped. I think a game which serves as a good example for combat-focused survival horror, which came out a few months before this game was announced, is Condemned Criminal Origins. That game still probably has the best first-person melee combat in any game I can think of, and was released in late 2005, so a little note-taking from Eden's part wouldn't have hurt. Let's get to the big one. The aspect of Alone in the Dark 2008 that everyone thinks of when they mock it for how bad it is. Let's talk about the driving. Like everyone else who has ever talked about this game has ever pointed out, I have to stress just how bad the driving in this game is. This is even more baffling when you take into consideration Eden Games' career history of primarily making driving games, so the vehicle sections being one of the worst things present here is even more confusing. You will drive around a fair bit, though there are 3 primary sections where it's a problem. The jumps you'll be making over ramps throughout the whole game, the part where flying lamprey eels try to wreck your car, and the famous first driving section where you cruise through New York as it explodes. The blame here can be pinned to the car handling physics, which are utterly broken. The rule becomes simple after you die a few times. Touch anything at all, be it something as big as a waist-high concrete wall or as small as a foot-high debris piece, your car will lose its mind. This results in slowing your momentum, bringing your car to a dead stop, or having it fly off into the air. While driving, view anything at all in front of you as a hazard which may or may not result in an instant death and drive around it. This is easier said than done though, since the controls for driving can be described at best as being floaty. The closest comparison I can make is taking the driving controls of Deadly Premonition and putting them in a game where you have to make split-second and precise movement choices to not touch anything. Except for the flying lamprey eel section, where you need to crash into everything, bringing the whole experience to a grinding halt. As you can probably imagine, the ramp jumps you make a fair bit in the latter half of the game are pains because if you touch anything at all, it can ruin your momentum, even a crack in the road. There aren't any upsides, the driving here is bad. How bad? Real bad. A 12 on the 10-point scale of badness. The final gameplay style implemented here to note is the open world aspect. Alone in the Dark 2008 takes place in New York Central Park, which from relatively early on opens up to let you drive around and explore it. During these chapters, the game is structured like a sandbox game, destination on your minimap, but gives you free reign to run around, hog wild, and explore random areas. The only problem with that is, up until the very end of the game, there isn't any real incentive to do so. I mean, there was a gun upgrade I found early on by going into a building off the intended path, but the difference between it and the default pistol was negligible and you could easily lose it if you used one of the game's other features, which we'll get to in a moment. For the vast majority of the game, the open world is a useless addition that the game made no effort on doing anything with a lack of side quests and incentive for exploration. That is, up until the game's conclusion, where to get access to the game's final area, you have to burn down about 30 of these Satan trees over the course of the last 2 chapters. You can't even light them up early on, as shown by my little escapade here, so unless I'm mistaken, the game forces you to do them at the last minute despite having them appear on your minimap from at least the 3rd chapter of this 8-chapter game. It's such a curveball to throw at the player. At the very end of this otherwise linear game, just run around to these 30 or so dots on the map and light them on fire. It's padding of the worst kind. But hey, you can always skip the sections of the game you don't like, right? One of the most bizarre selling points of Alone in the Dark 2008 is how the game's episodic structure lets you skip chapters if you get stuck. There are 2 problems I have with this. First of all, when you do skip a chapter, you'll spawn having lost almost all of your resources. When I tried to skip the Satan trees section, the game took away all of my health items, gasoline, and upgraded gun. It only leaves you with the bare essentials. Needless to say, this could actually put you in a worse situation than you were before, and the game doesn't let you have multiple save files, so experimenting with this isn't encouraged. And second of all, isn't this feature kind of an admission of defeat on Eden Games' part? If a selling point of your video game is that you can play less of it if you so choose, isn't that a sign that you might have to go back to the drawing board? Why play the game at all at that point if you can just skip it? Also, minor pet peeve, but you can't actually skip the Satan Trees section. It's mandatory to beat the game. The story of Alone in the Dark 2008 is uninteresting and uninspired. Basically, you have to stop the devil from destroying the world with this magic MacGuffin or whatever. It kind of feels like those action horror flicks in the mid-2000s, including the Alone in the Dark movie of all things. I'm serious, the game is tonally very similar to the Uwe Boll flick. The writing is also awful, and the characters are unlikable, Edward Carnby himself especially. What happened to him, man? He went from a grumpy private dick in the first 3 games, going on fun adventures, to some grim and gritty reboot man who grumbles and swears his way through every cutscene.
What are you talking about?
You forgot, but not to worry. I still have the keys to your mind. Now give me my stone!
I don't have your stone, and fuck you anyway!
He kind of reminds me of Ninja Theory's cringe-inducing Dante and their awful Devil May Cry reboot.
Fuck you!
Fuck you!
Fuck you!
Which makes it even more bizarre that this Carnby is apparently the same character as the original one. Why Eden felt the need to make this a sequel to Alone in the Dark 3 is beyond me, considering few who would have played this would have played the old ones. The voice acting doesn't help the characters, considering that they're bad all across the board. Because of that, I have to assume that the direction is to blame, considering that astute listeners might be able to hear that Edward's voice actor is actually James McCaffrey, the guy who played Max Payne. In other words, a good voice actor. The audio work in general is pretty unremarkable, with nothing standing out as good or really all that bad. That is with the exception of the game's shockingly good soundtrack. Alone in the Dark 2008 has a choir and pseudo-orchestral score done by Olivier Derivière, excuse the pronunciation, and the Mystery of the Bulgarian Voices Choir. It sounds unique, and honestly is the single best thing in this game. Try giving it a listen on its own if you're interested. Visually, the game looks rough. Animations are stiff and awkward, and the character models are lacking in detail. The damage done to the player model in particular looks bad, especially since you're given a close-up of it so many times. The crumbling city section looks okay, I guess, despite the frustration of actually playing through it. Alone in the Dark 2008 has one genuinely well done visual feature though, and that's the fire effects. When you light a fire, anything that can be ignited burns slowly over time, and this can be used to destroy obstacles in your path, or to give a wooden weapon some extra attack power. And it burns in a pretty decent simulation of real time, just watch as this debris pile crumbles. It will also follow gasoline trails you pour on the ground, making fire one of the most versatile tools at your disposal. All in all, a boatload of work must have gone into creating these effects, and Eden Games should be proud that they worked out mostly as intended. No other game has fire effects this well done even today, to my knowledge anyway, and I'd put good money on this being what got Eden the job in the first place. This was one of the least satisfying reviews I have ever worked on, because despite how much I've ragged on Alone in the Dark 2008 so far, I don't think I can properly convey just how bad playing the game actually is. The individual elements discussed on their own don't sound all that atrocious out of context, but while playing it all at once, I found this to be one of the most unenjoyable experiences I've had with a video game. It's a game that's even less than the sum of its parts. And at the end of the day, I can't say that I even hate it. If anything, I'm just disappointed because this is very clearly someone's passion project at Eden Games, if not the entire studio's. This had to have been years of the studio's unfulfilled creative desires packed into one game. They wanted to make an open world game, a survival horror game, an action platformer, what have you, and rather than try to make a different game for each, they put it all into one. And because of this, Alone in the Dark 2008 came out as an unfocused mess that did all of them poorly all at once.